This is the story of how I was made invisible in my own home. My name is Frida Lawson. Before I tell my story, kindly take a moment and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Thank you. Now back to my story. George came into our lives when I was only 7. I still remember the day clearly. My father, Raymond, lifted him from the back seat of the car, bundled in a navy blue blanket. My mother, Mabel, stood beside him, her eyes shining as though she had been handed a miracle. I stood on the porch, clutching a ragged teddy bear, watching the way they cooed over this baby who was not theirs by blood but quickly became theirs by heart. From the first moment, George was treated like royalty. My mother fussed over his feedings with a joy I had never seen directed at me. She bought him the finest baby clothes from boutique shops, soft cashmere blankets, and imported toys. I had grown up with second-hand hand-me-downs from cousins, but George never knew that kind of shortage. Every rattle was new, every tiny pair of shoes gleamed. I remember asking, "Mama, why didn't I have shoes like those when I was little?" She looked at me absently, as though she hadn't heard the question, before turning her gaze back to George with a smile that made me ache inside. As he grew older, the favoritism deepened. When George turned 5, my parents threw him a birthday party that could have passed for a small-town festival. Balloons filled the backyard, clowns entertained the children, and a magician pulled rabbits out of hats. I stood at the edge of the crowd, half excited but mostly bitter, remembering that my 7th birthday had been marked only by a small cake with my name spelled wrong in cheap frosting. When I pointed out the difference to my father, he brushed my comment aside with, "Don't be jealous, Frida. He's special." That phrase haunted me. He's special. It was said so often by both my mother and father that I began to believe I was the opposite, ordinary, replaceable, perhaps even unwanted. George was praised for everything he did. When he drew stick figures, they framed them in the living room. When he managed to recite a nursery rhyme, my mother called relatives to boast. I remember getting an A on my spelling test and rushing home to show my father. He barely glanced at the paper before muttering, "That's expected of you, Frida." Nothing surprising there. And then he turned to George, who had spilled juice all over the carpet, and said with a laugh, "Boys will be boys." It wasn't just in small gestures. George had privileges that set him apart in bigger ways. He was enrolled in private piano lessons at 9, even though he banged the keys without rhythm. I begged for ballet classes, but my mother shook her head, saying, "We can't afford extra activities right now." Yet the very next week, George got a brand new bicycle with chrome handles and a shining red frame. I was told I could ride it sometimes, though I quickly learned that sometimes meant never. Family dinners became a stage for his elevation. He sat beside my father, who cut his meat into neat pieces and encouraged him to eat more, while I was told to serve myself. My mother doted on him, asking about his day at school, clapping at every silly story he told, while I picked at my food in silence, invisible at the far end of the table. Even guests noticed. An aunt once whispered to me, "You must be proud of your brother. Your parents are over the moon with him." I forced a smile, but inside I was screaming, "And what about me? Don't they see me at all?" Cool events highlighted the imbalance even further. When I performed in the school choir, my parents arrived late and left early, barely offering a pat on my back. But when George played the triangle in kindergarten band, they brought a video camera and cheered so loudly the teacher had to ask them to quiet down. I felt humiliated, not only by their absence in my moments but by their overwhelming presence in his. As we both grew, my parents' favoritism hardened into something permanent. George was given his own room painted in colors he chose, while I continued to share a cramped space filled with peeling wallpaper. He had a dog bought especially for him, Max, a golden retriever he adored, while I was told pets were too much responsibility when I had once begged for a cat. Christmas, his pile of gifts nearly covered the tree skirt. Mine was modest, wrapped hurriedly, often with tags reading to Frida from Mom and Dad in rushed handwriting. I cannot count the number of nights I lay awake, listening to George laugh with my parents in the living room while I was told to go to bed early. I pressed my face into my pillow to muffle the sobs that came from feeling like an intruder in my own house. The laughter beyond my door was both proof and punishment, proof that they had room for joy, punishment that it did not include me. One evening, when George was about 12 and I was 17, the difference became too sharp to ignore. I had saved my allowance for months to buy a simple dress for prom. When I finally showed it to my mother, she frowned and said, "That's all you could manage. Don't you want to look presentable?" My heart dropped. Later that week, she returned from the mall with bags of clothes for George, including a leather jacket worth more than my entire savings. I wanted to scream, to ask why he deserved extravagance while I was left with shame. But I swallowed the words, knowing they would not be heard. George basked in the attention. He knew he was the favored one and used it to his advantage. If he wanted something, he only had to pout or act sick, and suddenly plans shifted to accommodate him. I, on the other hand, could fall ill and still be expected to clean my room or finish my chores. He was excused from responsibilities, I was buried beneath them. He was praised for effort, I was punished for mistakes. By the time I reached adulthood, I understood that the favoritism was not temporary, it was the law of our household. George was the sun around which my parents revolved, and I was little more than a distant planet, cold and forgotten. Pain of being invisible burned into my soul, shaping the way I saw myself and the world around me. Yet somewhere beneath the hurt, a small voice whispered that invisibility would not be my destiny forever. I held on to that whisper like a lifeline, even as I endured the daily sting of watching George wear the crown that had never been mine. The older I grew, the sharper the truth cut into me. My parents' neglect was not an accident, not a phase, but a constant rhythm of my life. They became the air I breathed, invisible yet heavy, pressing on me every single day. I was 13 when I first understood the depth of that emptiness. I had been sick with the flu, lying curled up in bed with a fever that burned my skin. My father, Raymond, peeked in once, glanced at me and said, "You'll be fine, Frida. Just tough it out." My mother, Mabel, was in the kitchen making George's favorite soup, and when I asked for some, she told me there wasn't enough to spare. That night, I heard her laughing with George as he slurped it from a bowl while I tried to swallow dry toast alone. That pattern repeated endlessly. Every time I needed comfort, I was told to be stronger, quieter, less demanding. When I sprained my ankle during gym class, limping home in pain, my mother scolded me for being careless. George scraped his knee the following week, and she rushed him to the emergency room, fussing over him as if it were life-threatening. I sat on the sidelines, invisible, wrapping my ankle in a dish towel. There were countless little moments like that. I remember standing in the doorway one afternoon, holding up my report card with straight A's, a shining record I had worked tirelessly for. My father glanced at it and muttered, "Good. That's expected." He turned back to George, who was waving around a drawing of a lopsided car. "Now that's creativity," my father boomed, hanging it on the fridge where my achievements never once earned a place. Neglect does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, cutting quietly into your spirit. It was the silence at dinner when no one asked me about my day. It was the empty chair at my school recitals, where other parents clapped and cheered while I scanned the audience for faces that never came. It was the absence of pride when I earned a scholarship to summer camp, the absence of congratulations when I won a small essay contest. My victories were swallowed by their indifference, and soon I stopped announcing them altogether. I started keeping journals, pouring my feelings into notebooks because I had no one in the house to confide in. Page after page was filled with questions I could not ask aloud. Why don't they love me the way they love him? What did I do wrong? Am I not enough? The words were heavy, but they were all I had. The neglect shaped the way I moved through the world. I became cautious about speaking up, afraid that no one would listen. I learned to cook my own meals, patch my own clothes, soothe my own pain. Independence was not taught to me as a proud skill, it was forced on me as survival. And yet, in a strange way, it planted seeds of resilience. Till the scars were undeniable. I can remember the sting of Christmas mornings when George tore open box after box of gleaming toys, while my pile sat small and unimpressive. One year I received a sweater 2 sizes too big, clearly picked in haste. I pulled it on, trying to hide my disappointment, while George twirled around with his new remote control car. My parents laughed, snapping photos of him, not even noticing my forced smile. Birthdays were the worst. I dreaded them because they reminded me of my place. For George, birthdays were grand spectacles, cakes layered high, balloons that filled the ceiling, neighbors invited to share in the celebration. Mine were quiet dinners, sometimes just a store-bought cake with my name scribbled incorrectly in icing like an afterthought. 16, my only gift was a paperback book with the price tag still stuck to the cover. I tried to be grateful, but when George turned 10 that same year and received a brand new gaming console, something inside me cracked. I wanted desperately to be seen, to be acknowledged, to hear the words "I'm proud of you" from either parent. But neglect starves the soul. It made me question my own worth, whispering in the back of my mind that perhaps I was undeserving of love. I carried that weight into school, into friendships, even into moments when teachers praised me. Their kind words could not undo the void at home. One memory stands above the rest. I was 18, preparing for graduation. I had worked tirelessly, juggling part-time jobs to afford my prom dress, studying late into the night to ensure I'd graduate with honors. When the ceremony arrived, I walked onto the stage, clutching my diploma with trembling hands. I searched the crowd for my parents. They were not there. George had a baseball game that evening, and they chose to attend that instead. The empty seats where they should have been felt like a final confirmation. I was alone in this family. Neglect does not simply vanish as time passes. It builds layers of doubt that follow you into adulthood. Even as I moved away to college, I carried the ache of never being enough. Phone calls home were brief and perfunctory, always circling back to George, how he was doing, what he needed, what they were buying for him. Rarely did they ask how I was managing, whether I had eaten, whether I needed anything. My existence seemed to orbit around his, even from miles away. Yet, despite all this, something inside me hardened into determination. Each moment of being ignored became fuel, a kind of quiet fire that told me I had to make something of myself without their help. If I could not earn their love, then perhaps I could at least build a life where I no longer needed it. That thought was painful but also liberating. Neglect taught me that love cannot be forced, that attention cannot be begged for, it must be freely given. I did not have that luxury, but I had the strength to endure. And though the scars would never fully fade, they became the proof of my survival, reminders that I had lived through the emptiness and was still standing. If George was the adored prince of our home, then I was the invisible servant who made his spotlight shine brighter. My parents didn't just favor him, they built their entire world around him as if he were the axis and the rest of us revolved in his orbit. George was 2 years younger than me, but you wouldn't know it from how he was treated. From childhood into adolescence, he was lavished with opportunities one could only dream of. My father, Raymond, enrolled him in the best schools, bragging to colleagues about his brilliant son, even when George's grades were average at best. Meanwhile, when I quietly earned high marks, they were brushed aside as though excellence was simply the bare minimum for me. I remember when I was 15, I asked if I could attend a summer writing program at a university 2 hours away. It was a chance to work with real authors, to develop the skill that had become my passion. My mother, Mabel, said, "We just can't afford extras right now, Frida." 2 weeks later, George was signed up for an expensive soccer camp in another state, complete with brand new gear and a personal coach. The hypocrisy stung so deeply that I cried into my pillow that night, determined never to ask for their support again. George didn't just receive material benefits, he received respect. At family gatherings, relatives were directed to him. My father would proudly announce, "This is George, our boy, destined for great things." Conversations swirled around his achievements, no matter how small. When I tried to share my own, I was cut off or ignored. "That's nice, Frida," my mother would say, her eyes already back on George. The message was clear. I could work 10 times harder, but I would never be celebrated the way he was. By the time George was 16, the favoritism had grown into something almost grotesque. He was gifted his first car, a shining black sedan used but spotless with a bow on top. I stood on the porch, arms crossed, pretending not to care as he revved the engine and waved to neighbors. My father clapped him on the back with pride. When I turned 18, I asked if I might have a small car to get to college. My father shook his head. "You can take the bus. It'll build character." What cut the deepest wasn't just the material disparity but the comparisons that came with it. "Why can't you be more like George?" became the refrain in my life. If I spoke up, I was told I was being dramatic. If I disagreed, I was called jealous. My individuality was erased under the shadow of his golden boy image. Even my friends noticed, whispering about the strange dynamic when they visited. Some stopped coming over altogether, uncomfortable with the way I was sidelined in my own home. George himself leaned into the role of the golden child. He basked in the endless attention, soaking it up like sunlight. He didn't always flaunt it cruelly, but there was an unspoken arrogance in the way he moved, certain that life would always bend in his favor. He grew accustomed to things being handed to him, to mistakes being forgiven instantly, to doors opening without effort. Where I had to claw my way up every rung of the ladder, he was lifted effortlessly to the next level. One memory seared itself into my mind. It was Thanksgiving, and our extended family had gathered around the long dining table. My uncle asked, "So, Frida, what are your plans after high school?" I had just been accepted into a prestigious university with a partial scholarship, and I opened my mouth to share. Before I could finish, my father interjected, "But George just made varsity on the soccer team. Isn't that incredible?" Table erupted in applause for him, my achievement left hanging in the air, unnoticed. I pushed food around my plate for the rest of the evening, too numb to eat. Inheritance was another glaring difference. Even in casual conversations, my parents spoke openly about how the family home would belong to George one day. "He'll take care of it," my father said. "He'll honor the Lawson name." I sat in the same room as though invisible, wondering what my role was meant to be, where I belonged in the family legacy. Their words confirmed what I had always feared. In their eyes, I was an extra, a placeholder, someone who could be disregarded. George enjoyed this pedestal, but he never considered the cost it had on me. Perhaps he didn't have to. When everything is handed to you, you don't stop to wonder who is left empty-handed. He strutted through life with a confidence born not of his own effort but of unearned praise. Meanwhile, I gathered every scrap of strength I had, determined to carve out an identity of my own. Yet the comparisons never stopped. When George stumbled, excuses were made. When I stumbled, blame fell squarely on me. When he succeeded, it was celebrated as proof of his greatness. When I succeeded, it was dismissed as luck. My life became a quiet rebellion, a constant battle to prove to them, to myself, that I was more than the shadow of the golden child. Times the injustice burned so hot in my chest that I wanted to scream, to throw it all in their faces. But I didn't. I swallowed the fire and let it smolder inside me, shaping a determination they could not see. George might have been the golden child in their eyes, but I knew deep down that gold can tarnish, while steel, tempered by fire, endures. It would take years before I had the chance to prove it, but even then, in the quiet ache of those teenage years, I carried the certainty that one day the balance would shift. And when it did, the glow of their golden boy would pale beside the brilliance of the woman they had ignored. When I left home for college, I carried little more than a suitcase, a handful of books, and the quiet determination that had been building inside me for years. I knew I couldn't rely on Raymond or Mabel for financial or emotional support. George had everything handed to him: a car, a bank account padded with allowance money, the reassurance of parents who would bail him out of any stumble. I had nothing but my will. My first semester was brutal. I juggled 2 part-time jobs, mornings at a campus coffee shop, evenings shelving books at the library. After work, I stayed up late cramming for exams, fueled by cheap instant noodles and endless cups of coffee. I watched other students laugh over meals in the cafeteria, their parents sending money for meal plans and weekend outings. Meanwhile, I stretched every dollar, counting coins at the laundromat, patching worn-out jeans because I couldn't afford new ones. There were nights I cried myself to sleep, exhausted and lonely, wondering if I would ever escape the shadow of my family's neglect. But even in those moments, I refused to break. I told myself, Frida, you are not doing this for them. You are doing this for you. That mantra became my anchor. I had dreams bigger than their disregard. I wanted to become a journalist, to tell stories that mattered, to carve out a space in the world where my voice would finally be heard. I poured myself into the student newspaper, writing articles late into the night, chasing leads while others partied. My professors began to notice. One, Dr. Harris, pulled me aside after class and said, "You have a rare gift, Frida. Don't waste it." Those words meant more to me than all the praise my parents had showered on George his entire life. Still, the struggle was constant. While George was celebrated for every small milestone, scoring a goal, passing a class, my victories were mine alone. I remember calling home once to share that I had been published in a regional magazine, a huge step for a college student. My mother's response was lukewarm at best. "That's nice, dear. Did you hear George made the starting lineup this season?" My throat tightened as I hung up, tears prickling behind my eyes. Their neglect followed me like a shadow, even across state lines. Yet each disappointment added fuel to my fire. If they would not acknowledge me, then I would create a life so undeniable that their opinions no longer mattered. I took on internships, sometimes working 70 hours a week, writing stories for free just to get my foot in the door. I sacrificed sleep, comfort, and any semblance of a social life. I said no to parties, no to distractions, yes only to the path that would carry me further than they ever imagined. There were moments I nearly broke under the weight of it all. I remember sitting in a freezing apartment one winter, the heating bill unpaid, my fingers stiff as I typed out an article due the next morning. I wanted to quit. I wanted to go home, even if home had never truly welcomed me. But I pushed on. I reminded myself that every sacrifice was an investment in a future where I would no longer be defined by what I lacked. The more I pushed, the more doors slowly began to open. I started receiving freelance assignments, small at first, but enough to cover groceries without panic. I learned how to negotiate, how to stand tall in rooms where no one believed in me. For the first time, I began to trust my own voice. Through it all, I thought of George. While I was fighting tooth and nail for every inch of progress, he coasted along on my parents' resources. He switched majors 3 times in college, dropped classes when they got difficult, and still received praise. He posted photos of vacations, his trips funded by Raymond and Mabel, while I spent spring breaks working double shifts. Contrast was stark, but instead of breaking me, it sharpened me. I realized something powerful in those years. The weight I carried was building muscle, not chains. Every rejection, every lonely night, every struggle was sculpting me into someone stronger, someone who would not crumble when life grew hard. George was soft, reliant on constant affirmation. I was hardening into steel. Till the loneliness lingered. Holidays were the worst. I often stayed on campus, too broke to travel home, but even when I managed a visit, it was always the same. The spotlight on George, the polite dismissal of me. I smiled through it, but inside I made silent promises. One day I will rise so far above this that your neglect will look small in comparison. That hidden fire became my compass. Kept me upright when my body begged for rest. Carried me through the cold winters, the empty bank accounts, the endless hours of labor. It whispered that one day all of this pain would make sense, not because they would suddenly love me, but because I would no longer need their love to define me. In time, I began to see the gift buried within the neglect. My parents' failure had forced me to stand on my own feet, to build resilience, to cultivate grit. They may have ignored me, but their neglect gave me something George would never have. The hunger to prove myself, not to them but to the world. That hunger never left me. Became the fuel that turned my silent struggles into a foundation, one strong enough to carry me further than any golden child could imagine. And though I carried the scars of their indifference, I also carried the strength it forged within me. The years that followed were the turning point. All those nights of quiet struggle, all the sacrifices no one witnessed began to pay off. My work caught the attention of bigger publications, and soon I was no longer just the girl hustling for scraps of opportunity. I was a journalist with a voice people wanted to hear. I still remember the first time I saw my byline on the front page of a national newspaper. I sat in the cafe where I used to scrub tables, holding the paper in trembling hands, my heart thundering with pride. No one in my family called to congratulate me. They probably didn't even notice, but it didn't matter. For the first time in my life, I didn't need their approval. I had the world's. One success led to another. I began traveling, covering stories that mattered, political scandals, human interest features, even overseas assignments that opened my eyes to the wider world. Each accomplishment felt like a step further away from the smallness of my parents' neglect, a step closer to the life I had built with my own two hands. Meanwhile, George's golden glow began to fade. Without the constant scaffolding of Raymond and Mabel's praise, cracks started to show. He drifted from one job to another, never satisfied, always expecting opportunities to fall into his lap. When they didn't, he floundered. He moved back into my parents' house more than once, his dreams shrinking while mine expanded. I won awards. I was invited to conferences. My words carried weight in places where George's name meant nothing. I bought my first house at 30, not with inherited money or family gifts, but with my own sweat and perseverance. When my parents came to visit, their eyes scanned the polished floors, the shelves lined with books I had written, the framed certificates on the wall. For once, they were speechless. It was then I realized the truth. I had risen above them, not just above George, but above the narrow vision my parents had for me. They had expected me to live small, overshadowed, silent. Instead, I had built a life that outshone even their brightest hopes for their golden child. The irony was bitter but satisfying. They had poured everything into George, shaping him into someone dependent and unprepared for the real world. They had neglected me, forcing me to fight alone, but in that fight I found strength, resilience, and success beyond their comprehension. Their favoritism had backfired. I did not rise out of spite. I did not build my life as revenge. I built it because I had to, because survival demanded it, because I refused to let neglect define me. Yet, when I stood in my own home, successful and secure, I couldn't deny the quiet satisfaction of knowing I had proven them wrong. One evening, after I received a national award for investigative reporting, I hosted a small gathering at my house. Colleagues, friends, and mentors filled the rooms, their voices full of admiration. My parents came, invited out of courtesy. They sat stiffly in the corner, watching as person after person congratulated me. For the first time in my life, I saw a flicker of something in their eyes, not pride exactly, but recognition. Recognition that I was no longer invisible. George was there too, slouched in a chair, his smile tight. He had not achieved much in the years since college, still leaning on my parents, still expecting the world to revolve around him. That night, the contrast between us was stark. He, once the golden boy, looked dim beside me. I, once the overlooked daughter, stood in the light I had created for myself. Outperforming them all was never about competition, it was about liberation. It was about proving to myself that I was more than the shadow they had cast me in. I had risen by light years, not because I was favored, but because I was forged in the fire of neglect. Now, when I look back, I do not see only the pain. I see the strength that pain gave me. I see the way it shaped me into someone who does not crumble, who does not wait for permission to succeed. My name, Frida Lawson, carries weight in places where my parents' favoritism holds no power. George may have been their chosen son, but I became my own chosen self. And in the end, that is the truest victory, to rise not because someone lifted you, but because you lifted yourself beyond the reach of their limitations. Thank you for watching. Kindly share in the comment section your thoughts and lessons learnt from my story.